Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Julie Cortez is joining me. How are you, Julie?
Good. How are you?
Very good, very good. Yeah, I was just saying it's kind of a cloudy and gray day here today in Texas, but it's nice and sunny where you are, right?
Yeah, sunny in Kansas City today, so I'm
Good.
happy.
So we want to talk about handling challenges during your presentations. And this is definitely something that a lot of my clients and students have struggled with. And the preparation goes a long way. So I'm going to go through some of my main points. And then, Julie, I want to get kind of your input on some of this as well from your perspective, because you've done a lot of speaking, a lot of presenting.
Yeah.
A couple major things I would say right off the bat is preparation is key. Knowing your material inside and out. And of course, it's not always possible or feasible to get the information fully in hand, because of your workflow, you might be really busy. But the higher the stakes and the more important the audience, the more critical it is for you to prepare. It's not something that a lot of people like to think about a lot, but it makes a big difference in the moment when you don't have time to think, when someone is challenging you or expressing skepticism towards your ideas. It's critical to have that ability. So knowing the material inside and out. A major tactic that I use, this is a major exercise that I do with a lot of my clients, is to do a mind map. And if you're not familiar with what a mind map is, it's basically if you say, okay, here's my argument number one, argument number two and three. So you list those out on a piece of paper or Word document, and then you draw leader lines. Okay, so in response to argument number one, what's the most likely challenge that I'm most likely to get from this audience, right? Just thinking through that in and of itself is very beneficial because it makes your ideas and your presentation stronger. And then based on that, okay, what they're going to challenge me on that, what's my response? So you literally just plan that out. Response number one or response number two, let's say. And that's just one particular challenge, maybe challenge A. Then you can do the same thing for challenge B or challenge C based on derived from the same initial argument. So you go through all your major points, especially the points that you think might be the most controversial in your presentation. And you can literally just map it out what the likely challenges are likely to be and what your responses are going to be. And so even if you can't predict every single potential challenge, even if you can only predict, let's say 60%, that's way better than 0%. Even 30% is better than 0%. So you're way better prepared and you're going to feel a lot more confident in the moment when the challenges occur. And also over time, you're going to get a lot better at predicting those challenges just by going through this exercise consistently. So mind mapping is a really simple and useful tactic that I use with a lot of people. I would also suggest you get feedback from colleagues in other departments or people that are just not familiar with the content that you're presenting, and kind of get a sense. You don't have to go through a full rehearsal. You can, but you don't have to. Just kind of give them the main bullet points in the outline and say, what do you think? What kind of challenges would you bring up if you wanted to challenge me? Subject your ideas to those challenges and to that process. Get input from someone who is your personal contrarian, someone who maybe you find kind of annoying. This is the time to leverage that to your advantage. If they tend to poke your ideas or they tend to really challenge you or be skeptical of things that you say, that's a good thing, right? You want to subject your ideas or your presentation to that kind of treatment, so that way you're much better prepared in the moment when the real event actually occurs. A couple other things I would say. When you receive challenges during a presentation, take your time in responding. A lot of times people assume that they need to very quickly rush in and respond to a challenge just because it's a challenge. You don't have to rush in. You can take your time. And in fact, taking your time and being more methodical and calm in the way you respond conveys a sense of power and confidence. And so that in and of itself, it makes you more persuasive than if you're kind of scrambling around and you have some of that desperate or frustrated energy. So remain calm and stable emotionally, breathe, make sure your muscles are relaxed and everything. Also, don't try to do a zinger. Don't try to do like a clever comeback unless you really know what you're doing. Because the risk is that you're going to look like an idiot, or you're going to piss people off, or you just look really arrogant and condescending if you try to have some kind of clever comeback and it doesn't land very well with that particular room at that time. So there's an art to doing that. It's an interesting skill. It's certainly an advanced skill, but if you're not really familiar with how to do that type of thing, if people are challenging you, you might have the urge, to give them a zinger or some kind of comeback right away, but resist that urge unless you really know what you're doing. Keep in mind also, a lot of times a challenge is not a challenge in the sense of a confrontation. A lot of times a challenge is just somebody who is trying to spark a conversation or trying to challenge everybody's ideas. And it's not necessarily an attack on you. And that's an important mindset shift. I've noticed that a lot of people in these situations assume that they're under attack. And so all of a sudden they get into like defensive mode. And that's not necessarily the case, especially if you can see that everybody is getting the same treatment in your workplace or in your team. Everybody gets challenged. Everybody gets pushed back from this particular senior leader. They like to really refine the ideas and see what the ideas are made of. And that seems to be the norm. Just be aware that it's not necessarily confrontational towards you specifically. Also, it may just be their personal communication style. They may just be very blunt or short, and they may come across as aggressive without intending to be. And so you may not like that. It may rub you the wrong way, but it's not necessarily a personal thing towards you. It's just the way they talk or just the way that they are trying. It's the way they naturally come across. So keep that in mind. That also gives you more peace of mind if you can get that perspective. And the last thing I would say is a lot of times people are trying to look assertive or they're trying to look powerful in front of their boss or in front of other colleagues in the room. And it just so happens that you happen to be in the crosshairs at that time. And so you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it's not about you specifically. They don't necessarily even care about your presentation or about your points or your content. It just so happens that this is an opportunity for them to look assertive and powerful in a certain way. And just like many of you watching this are trying to look more assertive, in the same way, other people may be trying clumsily to look assertive or to look powerful. They may get it right, they may not. But that may be kind of a motivating factor behind the scenes that's driving their behavior. So all of these things are things to be aware of in terms of your own confidence so that you don't necessarily feel so under attack, and that enables you to be more calm and to respond in a more methodical and rational way. So those are some of my initial thoughts on that, Julie.
That's awesome. I never really thought of the mind mapping tool for objections here or challenges. And I love mind mapping, especially having a creative mind myself, being an advertising copywriter. That's super helpful to get things down on paper and be able to visualize those things. So I'm definitely going to be trying that one. But, at the same point in time, I think that there's something to be said for being humble and being authentic if you don't have the answer, and just kind of saying, that's a great question. I don't have the answer, but let me find it for you. I know exactly who to ask, and give me your contact details afterwards, and I'll be sure to get you the answer. So I think people should just be not afraid to do something like that, because everybody's human. And of course, you're going to get stumped at some point in time, and that's okay. That's okay, as long as you handle it, again, confidently, and have that backup plan of just say, let me get you the answer and follow up with you later.
Yeah, absolutely. That goes to your credibility as a presenter or as a professional in your workplace. People can tell when you are putting on an act or when you really don't know what you're talking about, but you're trying to pretend like you do. People can tell. They may not know like the full story behind the scenes of what's going on, but they can tell like something's off. I'm not really buying what this person is selling. So it behooves you to be comfortable with saying that. A lot of times I find people are very uncomfortable just admitting that they don't have that information or they can't have a specific response. And you'd be amazed in like 90% of situations, to your point, Julie, like it doesn't hurt you at all. In fact, if anything, it actually increases your credibility because you come across as more transparent and more trustworthy. So you got to be strategic about it, right? You got to know when to kind of speak to the issue in a general sense, even if you don't have all the information, when to punt on the issue and say, I'll get back to you on that. When to literally just come out and say, honestly, that's a great question. It's not something that we've looked at. It's not something that I've looked at. So we'll look more into that and we'll get back to you, in a couple of weeks on that. You got to be able to know when to deploy which tactic, but it's a great point. It's something that everybody should be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. So what other challenges do you find your clients come up with when they're giving speaking presentations?
Well, look, they don't preempt challenges. This is another thing. A lot of times people are kind of blindsided by the challenges. So we talked about mind mapping, and we talked about being able to just plan things ahead so you know what's coming. But a lot of times you can go a step further and you can actually integrate the challenges into the presentation itself. So one way to do that is to specifically plan for this audience. Say, okay, I'm going to be presenting in front of this person, this person, this person. I have taken notes on past presentations that I've given to this group or to this team or to this division. So I know, based on my notes, the types of challenges that they tend to bring up. So therefore, I'm able to integrate those insights into my presentation. So for example, if I know that I'm presenting to the CEO likes to ask for a lot of details. For whatever reason, that just happens to be his or her thing, is that they like to ask and follow up and challenge presenters on details, to really dig to the bottom of the issue. Okay, so if I know that based on what I've observed in the past, I'm gonna include a lot of details in my presentation, right? It's pretty straightforward when you think about it, but it's something that a lot of people don't think about, or they don't connect those dots. So if I can include adequate details in my presentation, then I am preempting the challenge. I'm much less likely to get that challenge because the CEO observing my presentation, after 20 minutes, they say, okay, that was a really good presentation. I don't have any questions, right?
Perfect.
Another way is to proactively bring up the challenges in kind of a rhetorical question kind of way, and then answer the challenge, again, as part of your presentation. So you integrate it into the overall presentation. So for example, let's say that a common challenge that people bring up is the speed of deploying a marketing campaign. So I'm presenting on a new marketing campaign that we're doing, and a challenge that seems to come up a lot is how fast it's happening. Or maybe it doesn't come up a lot, but for whatever reason, based on the current situation in the company, I know that speed and efficiency is something that people are thinking about. So I might say the following. Here's our marketing campaign, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, et cetera. So now you all might be thinking, how long is this going to take? We've had challenges in the past in terms of rolling out campaigns quickly. So how are we going to do that differently this time? How are we going to speed things up? And the key difference this time is several things. One, we have an improved project management process. So we're using some new tools and solutions in that respect. That's going to make things a lot more efficient. Secondly, we're using better vendors. So we've already had a few RFPs and a few conversations happening on that. And thirdly, we've already hired a few additional freelancers, 3 freelancers actually recently, that we are planning to use to build out the creative for this campaign. So all of these factors are going to help us to deploy this campaign much more quickly than in the past. And so that's an example of like bringing up the challenge and then owning it and controlling the frame. Because if you can bring it up in your presentation, you can preempt it and you can control the frame, and psychologically you can kind of dictate how that challenge is thought about in the minds of the audience.
That's an excellent point. I give a lot of the same presentations over and over and over again. And, of course, I'm getting the same questions over and over and over again. So I've had to go back and tweak my presentations, which of course everyone should do, but definitely to cater to those questions. For example, you mentioned freelancers. I talk to them quite a bit, or students studying to be freelancers. And, sometimes they'll ask, what's the going rate, or how do I find work? Like, I know going into it what the top questions are. And so now I have gone back and built that into my presentation. So to hopefully prevent that from happening in the end, not that it's bad that they have additional questions at the end, but I can go ahead and overcome those questions throughout the middle of the presentation. So there's no interruptions there.
Yeah, exactly. So the preparation makes such a huge difference. And now I'm curious from your perspective, Julie, based on your experiences, other types of challenges, or how you've managed those kind of impromptu or unexpected challenges in the presentation, right? So if, certainly you've planned and you've prepared in many of those cases. There's always those situations where it's a challenge or a skepticism that you didn't expect, right? How have you managed those in the past?
I think preparation goes a long way. And for me, a lot of it has been more of the material sense than the actual speech or presentation that you're giving. For example, what happens if, for whatever reason, your PowerPoint isn't working or your keynote isn't working? Are you prepared? Do you have a printed backup, ready to go? What happens if you get to wherever it is in virtual world, right? You're in person. What happens if you get there and you realize your laptop is running low on battery and you need to plug in? Well, what if the plug's all the way across the room? Do you have an extension cord on you? Mm-hmm. That's always helpful. What about your remote control? If you use a remote control to advance the slides, what if your battery dies and you weren't prepared for that? Always bring extra batteries with you. So there's little things that you can do to really help along the way. If your PowerPoint crashes or your keynote crashes, maybe you have some sort of line ready to go where you put everybody at ease, and you go at it with confidence, but at the same point in time, you're human, and these things happen. So you just don't skip a beat. You keep going. I had just happened the other day. I was giving a 3-hour workshop. And we took a break, and I turned my camera off, and my picture came up on the screen. And so I could go refill my water, right? And I came back and I turned the camera back on to give the second half of the presentation, and my camera wasn't working. It was just pitch black. And I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And it was so, of course, in the moment you're like, oh, but you're like, okay, Zen, you become Zen-like. And I'm trying different things, and people are offering different suggestions, which was great. It was so helpful. But at the end of the day, I had to jump off the Zoom call and log back in, and that solved the problem. But I handled it with humor, I handled it with grace, and nobody thought any differently. So I think if you're just prepared ahead at time, handle things like a normal human being, don't let it, get the best of you. I think those things are really going to be helpful going forward.
A client of mine recently had an interview with a small YouTube channel. So it wasn't a huge high stakes situation. He's done a lot of much higher stakes presentations and keynotes. He's done TEDx talk. And so in the course of the interview, his fire alarm went off in his apartment. And that was kind of flustering, right? He got kind of flustered by that. And to your point, is that you got to have good humor, So it was a good learning experience for him in that sense, because you never know what's going to hit you. In the case of live TV or live radio, that also ups the ante. A lot of people are very stressed out just being in that situation of a live event, live broadcast, right, to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so that in and of itself is anxiety inducing. And then on top of that, there's some unexpected interruption or a technical glitch. And so I think having a great attitude about the whole thing is critical. So whether the interruption comes from a human being or a non-human factor, the lighting goes dark, the fire alarm goes off, your camera shuts off or malfunctions, who knows, right? You still got to push things forward because the show must go on, right? The audience is there to receive your information and to get value from you. And always remembering that is critical. It's not about me as the presenter. This is about the audience experience and what they're taking away from the presentation. I think having that mindset and that overall attitude makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. Everybody in every situation, people are thinking, what's in it for me? That's just human nature. And so we've got to remember that factor in everything that we do.
Yeah. So speaking of mindset, I just want to touch on a few other quick points here. A lot of times when people challenge you in a presentation, they might be rude, or they might be aggressive, or they might have negative energy for whatever reason. I like the analogy of giving people enough rope to hang themselves,
Hmm.
right? And what does that mean? It means if someone is being rude to you in a meeting, that reflects more poorly on them than it does on you.
Yes.
In the moment, we're thinking in our mind, it's like fight or flight. It's like, oh my God, this person is such a bully towards me. I have to fight back. But if you take a step back and you think strategically, you realize like, actually, this person, by being rude, they're undermining themselves and their own image in front of everybody else, right? That's a very important insight. That also gives you that mental stability and that emotional stability to be able to manage the situation a lot better. Um, if somebody interrupts you when it's your time to speak, let's say you're allocated to speak for 20 minutes solid, and then there's going to be Q&A at the end. But let's say somebody just interrupts you in the middle of the presentation. Here's the thing: if they interrupt you, you can interrupt them back,
Yeah.
right? They've violated the rule, so you can be the person that regains order, reimposes order on the situation, and do it in a positive and confident way. Don't be passive aggressive. Don't be rude or aggressive back to them. Don't get frustrated, right? Especially if and I talked about this in a previous webinar, that certain people are going to be difficult.
Yeah.
So that certain people are likely to be kind of salty or to be a little aggressive, in their style. Fair enough, so you can plan accordingly, so it doesn't blindside you. But regain control of the discussion. Don't let it get away from you. Don't fall into the temptation of actually engaging with their point, right? Even if somehow they're able to slip in a key question or a point by interrupting you, if it's not an appropriate time for you to respond to that question, just say, you know what, let me get to that in a little bit. We'll have time for questions at the end, right? Or say something like, you know what, let's address that in a little bit. I definitely want to address that, but let me continue on. I want to make sure we get to all this information before we run out of time, something like that. And saying it with a positive and confident tone of voice. So you're in control, and you're not showing the frustration, even if you are frustrated, but don't let that show in the moment. It's important to keep things moving for the benefit of the audience as a whole. Don't let one bad apple ruin the experience for everybody.
Totally. And as you're sitting here, telling these tips, I'm thinking of two different stories that came up. And if I may share, one of which I was giving a presentation, and somebody asked a question that it was a legal question and I couldn't answer it. I was like, well, you'll have to answer your lawyer. Well, there just happened to be an attorney in the house, right? And so he starts answering it, but then the other person had all these questions and they were going back and forth. Well, it started taking over my presentation, right? And I said, this is really good dialogue, y'all. However, I want to be cognizant of everybody's time here, everybody in the room. So let's get back on track. You two exchange cards and you can catch up later, So that's one way how I was able to regain control, because I only had 45 minutes for that presentation. And then the other thing I was thinking of, I was on a Zoom call with, I don't know, maybe 30 people. Two of us were hosting the call. And as we were wrapping things up at the end, I gave a plug for a free event that was coming up. And for whatever reason, one of the individuals in the Zoom room just threw his hands up in the air. Like he was so exasperated with me for sharing this free event. Literally, he was like, oh, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And, I didn't want to lose my focus of what I was saying. And I certainly had no idea what was wrong. And I didn't want to give him that benefit of the doubt. Like I didn't even want to ask, And so I just maintained composure. I kept looking at the camera, not at him or at anybody else's reactions. And I just kept going. But like you said, it's a reflection upon them, not upon you. And I maintain style. I maintain grace and composure. And at the end of the day, I feel like he's the one who was made to look bad, not me. So thank you for bringing that up. That's an excellent point.
Absolutely. It's funny. You as the presenter, you notice everything, because when you're in that position, you're hypersensitive to everything that's happening in the situation. But other audience members don't necessarily notice that stuff, or it's like very on the periphery, you know, like it barely penetrates their consciousness. And so a lot of times we forget that as presenters because we're so hyper focused on every little thing. When something small goes wrong, or somebody has a negative reaction like that, throwing their hands up randomly, you know, that's like a huge thing in our mind.
Yeah.
But it's not a huge thing for almost anybody else in the room, you know? And so by you as the presenter maintaining the composure, you're able to finesse the situation and it becomes a non-issue because it's a non-issue for you, so it's a non-issue for the audience. And I love your story also of the lawyer and the other person going back and forth, and you manage that situation by regaining control, you know, being essentially the MC, the master of ceremonies, right? Managing the dynamic. There's countless presenters that would totally just lose all control in that situation. And it would be like out of a 45-minute presentation, you end up blowing 8 minutes of these people going back and forth. And then inevitably what happened, there's a third person that would jump in and start giving their 2 cents. Well, my uncle is an attorney and he would disagree with you and blah, 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 you know? And then it's like, oh crap, now I've really lost it, right? But, you know, and you had a great attitude and great energy. And so people want to follow that. I think, and this is a good point to end on, you know, people want leadership. They're looking for those leadership cues. And if they're not getting it from you as the presenter, then they're going to be wide open to whatever bossy or aggressive person or talkative person happens to jump in. And they're going to just automatically defer to that person. So the power play and the dynamics in that sense makes a big difference. And it's something for you to be aware of as a presenter.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that.
So we do this every week, every Tuesday. We do a webinar, a live webinar. Next week is going to be a speaker analysis of Simon Sinek. I'm going to be analyzing one of Simon Sinek's speeches. Simon Sinek is obviously one of the biggest business speakers out there. So I'm going to be analyzing a portion of that and looking at some of his tips and tricks, what makes him such an effective public speaker. But other than that, we're going to leave it there for today. I want to thank you for watching. And Julie, thank you so much for coming and contributing.
Thanks for having me.